Photic School rented out one of their classrooms to the Narcotics Anonymous group. Together we stand. They met every Tuesday and Thursday from 7 to 8 in the evening. What a bunch of druggies. Mike joked. Everyone knows meetings are supposed to be from 8 to 9. But not you. Sorry, Mike. We'll do better next time. No. Carl smiled, hugging his sponsor. No, it's okay, Mike sighed. This way I can have a meeting and still have time to hold a grudge against Kirsten, he said. It's good to have goals, Kirsten, Mike's wife said, as she entered the classroom. Carl, your coffee sucks. Mike easily lifted his wife. He was 6 feet, 6 inches tall, and she was 5 feet 4. Have I ever told you I love you? He asked as they kissed. No, she smiled. Really? I'd take a look at that if I were you, he said, laughing as she squealed and slapped him. Oh my God, I'm sorry I'm late, Lauren said, running into the room. No problem, it gave me a chance to get some work done. Carl smiled and hugged her. Lauren took it upon herself to organize the meeting, and then complained about the coffee. At least it got made, remarked Dauphin, Lauren's sponsor. Since it was Thursday night, and they had step meetings on Thursdays, they discussed the 4th step. Carl, Lauren exclaimed loudly. Huh. Carl snapped out of his fog and looked around at the 15 faces staring back at him. I asked if you wanted to share with us tonight. Lauren snapped, getting a little angry. No thanks. I think I'll just listen tonight, Carl said. Because you're so good at it, Dauphin muttered, eliciting laughter from many in the room. Now all those who are blameless, please raise your hands, Carl hissed. This wasn't the first time he'd clashed verbally with Dauphin. Dauphin, an African-American woman, was prone to overdramatizing her problems. Her long monologues were filled with too many details and more complaints than solutions. She often offered unsolicited, unnecessary criticism of other people's communication, and was frequently harsh in her remarks. With 17 years of sobriety, she considered herself the guiding voice of the group, despite the second tradition stating that only a loving God governed their group. Jade, an attractive, slightly plump Asian American woman, voiced several grievances against her husband Brian. Because Jade often showed up at meetings with the odor of alcohol on her breath, none of the women would sponsor her. As a result, Jade had no first-hand knowledge of any of the steps and used the meetings as a dumping ground. Carl slipped out right after reciting the Lord's Prayer. Dauphin had a habit of being snide during meetings, and then, right afterward, wanting to correct herself and hug. Carl was in no mood for a hug, or to listen to Dauphin's sarcastic, self-serving remarks. He had pointed out to her more than once that her apologies were not so much apologies as excuses for her bad behavior. He just wasn't in the mood for that tonight. Call your sponsor, huh? He thought, pulling away. No one asked him about Tiffany. Since it had been almost 3 months since his wife had attended a meeting, many people just assumed Tiffany had gone on another bender and started using again. Carl sighed. It was actually much worse than that. They had met at DeHart's chemical dependency unit. Carl had developed a problem with prescription pills after a car accident put him in a wheelchair. Tiffany had an addiction problem. Her boyfriend had gotten her hooked. Tiffany, take him downstairs, the counselor asked, shifting awkwardly in his seat. Thank you, Tiffany, the counselor said loudly. Diego, care to share why you asked that question? Diego mumbled something embarrassed. Then the counselor asked Carl what had brought him to CDU. Carl recounted the excruciating pain, especially when he was learning to walk again. The pain in my back and my hips, they went completely loose when that drunkard hit me. God, the pain was so bad I swore I was going to die, he said, smiling strainedly. It's hard to tell how much of the pain was real, and how much was just my illness making. Me think the pain was real, he admitted. A short time later, Tiffany confessed to the group that she went to the CDU at her attorney's urging. See, me and Tim, we get knocked to the ground. This fucking pig pretends to want him. The next thing you know, they put me and him on the ground, and she whined. To Carl, Tiffany was just another patient in the IQ. She just needed to make a friend. But he'd made friends with almost everyone except Diego. So he was genuinely surprised and pleased when Tiffany came up and hugged him at the meeting. After they finished the program, he was genuinely pleased when she asked for his phone number and suggested meeting for pizza. She was pretty, with long red hair, adorable freckled skin, and big brown eyes in her round face. She had large breasts for her small stature, almost no ass, and long, full-like legs. Carl was handsome with a square face, thick brown hair, and big brown eyes. They dated for a few months, and then got married just before they each celebrated 6 months. Clean. Shortly after they both received their annual medallions, Carl came home and saw a man leaving their rented house. He found Tiffany cleaning up. "What the hell?" she yelled as he was about to leave. "You knew what I was when you married me." "No, Tiffany," he shouted back. Thanks to their sponsors and a few sessions with an unlicensed counselor, they made up. Tiffany admitted she was wrong and promised to be faithful. Honesty, huh? She smiled strainedly. "I promise God and you to be faithful, right?" "Yes, I was wrong to assume you'd realize that." Carl grudgingly agreed. "You know what happens when you assume," Tiffany smiled. "Yeah, but there's no assumptions here, okay? I don't take my pants off." "You don't take your pants off, okay?" Carl said. They received their 2-year medallions and made the group groan good-naturedly as they thanked each other for helping them stay clean and sober. Then Tiffany began to be less willing to attend meetings. She had to stay late at work. She was tired. She didn't like Dauphine or Kirsten. "No one does." Carl snapped back. Carl then learned that Tim had somehow dodged an actual prison sentence. Carl went to Miller's electronics store and bought some voice-activated recorders. "It'll pick up at least her side of it if she's talking on her cell phone," said Brandon, the chubby boy behind the counter. "But if they're texting, not so much." Brandon showed Carl how to clone her cell phone. "Illegal," Brandon whispered. "But hey, at least you'll know, right?" Carl should have been relieved. Tiffany's cell phone showed her calling him, texting him, calling her mom, and very rarely calling Stacy, her sponsor. However, she became much more confrontational, almost belligerent with him. As he told Mike, Carl couldn't remember the last time they had made love. If Tiffany wasn't screaming in his face, complaining, she was nervous, jumpy, and defensive. But the keylogger he installed on their home computer showed nothing. The cloned cell phone also revealed nothing. One day Carl heard Tiffany's purse make a slight buzzing sound. He saw that her phone was on the charger. At this point, she was in the kitchen, cooking, basically opening cans, pouring them into pots and heating them up. He quickly retrieved a second phone from her purse and went into the second bedroom. "Carl, dinner," she called after a minute. "I'll be right there," Carl called out, hurrying to map her phone number. "Now," she called out shrilly. All right," he said. After an unappetizing dinner, Tiffany grabbed her purse and went to the bathroom. She came out a minute later, pulling out her cell phone as she went. "What?" "It's right here on the charger," Carl shouted, pointing at it. "Not that." "Ah, yes, here it is," Tiffany said, continuing to look around. Carl would have laughed if his heart hadn't been breaking. He managed to map her second phone, then kicked it under the couch. Tiffany found him later that evening and felt both relief and excitement. She was relieved to have found her phone, but also confused and anxious. She knew she had looked under the couch not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. While all this madness was going on at home, Carl's professional life was on the rise. Gordon King of King Sanitation was a good man who believed in rewarding his employees. Carl was next in line to become the company's head of accounting. "Carl, by the way, I just love that name. It's the coolest name ever," Gordon said. "My father was a big fan of the Death Wish movies." Carl admitted, "That's why he named me after Charles Bronson." "Your mother must be such an ass," Gordon smiled. "Anyway, I was talking to Arnold the other day, and he said you'd be his first choice to head up the Santa Barbara office." But we already handle all the bookkeeping, Carl said. No, no, not just accounting, the whole office, Gordon said. Huh, Carl said, stunned. The latest series of messages between his wife and Tim had broken Carl's heart again. Tiffany had gone from sniffing to smoking. She quit her job, which became a common joke at most NA meetings. Some people quit drugs because they interfere with their work. But an addict will quit their job because it interferes with their drug use. Carl immediately froze their joint bank account, canceled all credit cards, and thanked God that his mother had advised him to put his gold coin collection in a safety deposit box. The key to that box was on his keychain. But even more painful to Carl than the fact that Tiffany was smoking was the fact that she would once again confess her love for Tim. The fact that she was having sex with her boyfriend caused him great pain. But her words of love for Tim shattered his heart into a million pieces. So go home, talk to your wife about it. Let's see, it's Tuesday. Do you think you can give me an answer by Friday? Gordon said. Yes, sir, I think I can, Carl replied, standing up and shaking the man's hand firmly. By the way, if you were looking for a lawyer, who would you recommend? Carl asked before leaving the office. Donald Pellichet, Gordon said at once. He's been my lawyer and friend for 15 years. In his own office, Carl arranged to meet with Donald Pellichet the next day. Then he leaned back in his chair and wondered if he should even tell Tiffany about Gordon's offer. Donald Pellichet looked at the text messages Carl had managed to copy. Then he shook his head solemnly. They were obtained illegally, so we can't use them. And you just told me that the guy who showed you how to do it, he told you it was illegal. Donald said, reading the latest correspondence between Tiffany and Tim. Besides, it's a no-fault state. You don't need a reason to get a divorce. Donald added. Carl told Donald about the upcoming promotion. Damn. Then we need to hurry up and file the paperwork before Gordon makes this promotion. Official, right? Said Donald. While Carl and Donald were filling out the paperwork, Tiffany discovered that her credit cards were not working. She also discovered that her debit card was not working at the ATM. Carl picked up the phone after the fifth ring. What, Tiffany? I'm at work, he snapped. My cards aren't working, Tiffany yelled into the phone. I told you someone stole them when I was at the meeting at St. Thomas. Carl lied. That's why I froze them before this one could steal them. Donald chuckled and Carl smiled at him. But how am I supposed to? Shouted Tiffany. Well, where are you? I'll be right over and get you everything you need. Carl smiled, enjoying her panic. Tiffany hung up the phone. What happened? Demanded Tim, dropping heavily to the ground. The cards were stolen and the dumbass cut them, Tiffany shouted. So, come on. How about some rings, huh? Demanded Tim. My wedding rings. Are you crazy? Screamed Tiffany. A couple of slaps to the face made Tiffany change her mind. What hurt Carl's pride the most was that his wife was willing to betray him. And his love for the sake of this jerk, who thought nothing of slapping Tiffany and believed it was right to use a wire hanger on her if she didn't submit to his demands. At Tuesday night's Together We Stand meeting, Carl talked a bit about his possible promotion. He didn't talk about his broken heart. Understand, there are NA meetings in California too, commented Mike. Yeah? Are you sure about that? Joked Carl. Dauphine went on again about her problems, making a few snide remarks about Carl. He slipped out as soon as they finished reciting the Lord's Prayer. Tiffany wasn't home when Carl returned, so he made himself a frozen dinner in the microwave. He brought a steaming tray of meatloaf and creamy potatoes into the living room, set it on the coffee table, and went to turn on the TV. He noticed it was gone. The mounting brackets had been ripped out of the wall, severely damaging the sheetrock. You're kidding me, shouted Carl, and our bail too. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Even though his appetite was gone, he forced himself to eat the microwave meal. Then he called Tiffany's cell phone. She didn't respond, so he left a message that someone had stolen their TV. She returned a few minutes later, claiming she had absolutely no idea what could have happened to the TV, but tried to keep Carl from calling the police. What, Tiffany? If I didn't take our TV and you didn't take our TV, Then our TV was stolen, Tiffany. He snarled. She tried to snatch the phone out of his hands and even bit his hand. When he held her at arm's length, the police dispatched officers Elise Richards and Eric Miller. They took statements, pictures of the wall, and inspected the house to determine if the criminals had taken anything else. They then promised to do their best. Did you get the impression she was high? Elise asked her partner as they returned to their cruiser. And coming down hard, Eric agreed. Inside the house, Tiffany scratched her face. The itching was driving her crazy. See, they'll do everything they can to find him. She shouted to Carl. They won't do anything. It's the biggest waste of time, Carl shouted back. But at least our insurance will get a copy of the police report. Oh, she brightened. They'll buy us another one. $1,000 deductible, Carl reminded her. But after that, yes, and our landlord gets a copy too. Heck, $800 bail, really? $800. But can we get it back? As Tiffany, hopefully. Yes, when we move out, Carl said. But without a police report, he'd charge us for that torn plaster. The computer was almost 5 years old, and the monitor was even older. It was an old CRT. It didn't even support the latest graphical interface. But Carl made sure to save all his personal data on a flash drive. And then deleted the information from the hard disk. He doubted very much that Tim was smart enough to figure out how to use this information. But he didn't want to take any chances. At the Cash for Gold pawn shop, Alice and Eric watched a tape of Tiffany and Tim, bringing in a TV and some jewelry. I told you so, Elise and Eric said in unison. Jinx, Elise said. Now you can't speak until someone calls your name. Shut up, Eric laughed. God, how old are you? 5. Vanessa LeBlanc, Tim's parole officer, provided Tim's last known address, and they headed there. Tim's mother's house was small and run down, much like many houses in the Kimball neighborhood. Since the house was in Kimball, Elise and Eric called for backup from a Kimball unit. The reinforcements met them 2 blocks from the target. After coordinating their actions, Eric drove the cruiser back to the house. Open up, police. Eric yelled, pounding on the door. Freeze Tim, Elise shouted as Tim ran out the back door. While Tim was being put in one police cruiser and Tiffany in another, Carl was telling Gordon King that he was going to take the job in Santa Barbara. Fine, Gordon smiled, but please refrain from officially announcing the promotion. Carl requested. Wife troubles, guessed Gordon. Mr. Pellichet told you, Carl asked. No, client attorney privilege. Gordon replied, it's written all over your face. While Carl was eating roast beef at Tommy's Pawboys. Not because he was hungry, but because he knew he needed to eat. Tiffany and Tim were sullenly munching on their bologna and American cheese sandwiches on white bread. Carl then went to the name meeting at St. Thomas Aquinas School. After the meeting, he told Mike about the theft and Tiffany's reaction. Really? Groaned Mike. Shit like this happens and I don't find out until the next day. But I haven't used, Carl remarked tiredly. There's that, Mike agreed. Turning on his cell phone, Carl saw he had received 2 calls. Both from the Bender Police Department. Will you accept the charges from? Honey, please, I didn't do anything. You have to pick me up. Please press 5, said a mechanical voice. I thought you weren't allowed to call a cell phone from prison. Carl said, deleting both of Tiffany's messages. He didn't feel like driving home, so he went to Jitter's coffee shop. In Bender, Louisiana, a few blocks from his house and the meeting place. Hi, chirped the cute blonde as he walked in. Hi, he replied, a tired smile appearing on his face. Looks like you could use some coffee, the girl suggested. Yeah, but I'll settle for what you've got here, Carl joked. The girl smirked. Give me a superior blend with soy milk, Carl ordered. He swiped his debit card and carried the hot mug to a seat. Then he sat down and stared into the dark brown liquid. A few more people entered, snapping Carl out of his reverie. Thank you, the pretty blonde said, as Carl returned the ceramic mug to the counter, rather than just leaving it on the table. You're welcome, he said, and left. He felt empty and cold. Lying in the bed he shared with Tiffany, he pulled a pair of socks over his feet. It helped take the chill away a little. But sleep still wouldn't come to Carl. Because Tiffany allowed Tim to take the TV, and since she was the owner, Tim was released at arraignment. Tim failed a drug test and was supposed to be held for a parole violation. But Ethel Yax, an overworked court clerk, missed it, and Tim was released. Tiffany was also cleared of the theft since it was her TV. But she was accused of falsifying a police report, and a trial date was set. Just before leaving work to go to the NA meeting on Thursday night, Carl heard his cloned phone ring. Pulling it out, his eyes widened. Tiffany mentioned that by working at King Sanitation, Carl had good life insurance. Donald Pellichet listened to Carl's call and advised him to call the police. Do you own a firearm? Are there any firearms in your house? At least Richards asked Carl. A 12-gauge shotgun, but honestly, I don't even remember if there's ammo for that gun, Carl said. The last time I went hunting with my dad was 10 years ago. By the time Carl left the police department, he was already late for the Thursday evening NA meeting, so Carl drove to the coffee shop again. Hey, back again. The blonde greeted him cheerfully. Yeah, the last cup almost did the trick. Carl joked, and she smiled. The hall was crowded, but Carl managed to find a vacant booth. The blonde saw it was time for a break, grabbed her bologna and American cheese sandwich, a banana, and headed to the back of the store. But Ricky, the manager, had covered the small table with last week's receipts. David Torres, the owner of Jitters, had threatened to fire Ricky and the entire staff. Start fresh. Money is flowing out the back door, and someone is doing it, David grumbled. Upon entering the main hall, the blonde couldn't find a single stall available. Then she saw a sad-eyed customer sitting alone behind the counter. Hey, mind if I sit here? She asked. Sure. He nodded toward the bench across the hall. My name's Morgan, by the way, she said, unwrapping her sandwich. Carl, he replied, continuing to play Scrabble on his phone. So, what are you doing? Morgan asked, nodding toward his phone as she stuffed her mouth with her sandwich. Waiting. Just waiting. Carl said tiredly, waiting for my wife to kill me. Morgan froze, her blue eyes wide. I meant on your phone, she finally said, swallowing a mouthful of sandwich. Oh, he smiled, shaking his head, playing Scrabble. But the computer cheats. Oh, I love that game, Morgan said. Yeah, said Carl. Well, here we go. He started a new two-person game. Morgan pondered for a long moment, then played Array. Oh, that's a good word, Carl praised. Hey, Morgan, did you finish your lunch yet? A coworker called out almost 30 minutes later. Shit. Morgan smiled. Here, I'll keep this. We'll pick it up next time, said Carl. He showed her that he was saving it under the name Morgan, and she nodded approvingly. By Carl, I hope your wife doesn't kill you, Morgan said. At least until you win, right? He smiled. Her hair was the color of honey, and her face was round, with a slightly large nose. But a very cute smile. At 5 feet 2 inches, she carried about 40 to 50 extra pounds. Most of it on the back of her body and thighs. Carl didn't know how old she was. But he was sure she was much younger than his 33 years. By Carl, Morgan said cheerfully, placing the empty ceramic mug on the counter. By, remember that a 19-point word is about 2, he smiled. Once I find where to put that X, the game will be over, she teased. But Eliza Richards advised against going home. They had no idea where Tim and Tiffany were. But I need to buy clothes. I have to go to work after all, Carl objected. What kind of question is that? Yeah, you can stay here, Mike said when Carl called. Hell, I'll make Kirsten sleep on the couch, and you and I can cuddle on the bed. Mike, that's my bed, Kirsten laughed. Eric and Eliza escorted Carl into his small house. He took a suit and toiletries. There were no more text messages between Tiffany and Tim on the cloned phone. Which made Carl, as well as Eliza and Eric, realize that the lovers were likely together. The ambush in front of Tim's mother's house yielded nothing. By the time Carl got home from work that Friday, they still didn't know where the two lovers were. Call her cell phone, Eric suggested. Maybe we can get her location. The call went straight to her cheery voicemail. Carl then called Tim's phone. He had the number, thanks to the cloned phone. It went straight to voicemail, to Mike called Carl to let him know that his car was demolished. And he needed a driver for his 5 a.m. job. Yeah, and Kirsten has the night shift tonight. Mike apologized. So Carl headed over to Jitters. Morgan tried to smile. See, your wife hasn't gotten to you yet. No, not yet, Carl agreed. Ellie, we have a 15-minute restroom break. Morgan addressed the Asian American woman working with her. Okay. The girl shrugged. There was hardly anyone in the small store. Hey, Morgan said, sitting down at the table with Carl. Hey, let's see. Yeah, your turn, Carl said. Look, is this the owner? There's about $500 missing. And since he can't figure out who's taking it, he fired everyone. Morgan said tearfully. Oh, shit. Sorry, said Carl. He smiled, strainedly. Well, if my wife doesn't have time to kill me. I'm moving to Santa Barbara in 2 weeks. You want to come with me? You can sit on the beach and sunbathe while I bust my ass at work. Morgan smiled. Carl, she shouted, and I wish you weren't involved in this, he said. I'm leaving, she said, and rose to her feet. But Carl saw Morgan smiling. As she walked away, his cell phone rang. Hello? Asked Carl. Mike is such an idiot, came Kirsten's cheerful voice. Just stop by the bar and I'll give you a key. Good Lord, why do you men make everything so complicated? Because we know you women will fix everything for us. Carl said and emptied his cup. So when are we heading to Hollywood? Asked Morgan as Carl set the empty cup on the counter. Santa Barbara, but not this Tuesday, next Tuesday, Carl smiled. He turned to leave, then turned back. Jokes aside, want some? He asked. Morgan stared at him for a moment. She rented a room from an older woman, paying $400 a month. She was trying to save up for college. Morgan was the unfortunate type, whose parents made too much for her to qualify for aid. But they also didn't make enough to afford to send her to college. Every time it looked like she would be able to pay for the semester, there was a new expense. Last month, it was car repairs, and already the car was making that funny sound again. Again, and this month, it was tooth decay, and Dr. Lemoyne said she had a second, smaller cavity that needed to be looked at as soon as possible. And then Mr. Torres fired the coffee shop staff. Thanks. But I don't even know you, she smiled. Damn, not only are you pretty, but you're smart. Carl smiled and walked out. I don't think the coffee is that good. Officer Eric Miller joked as Carl walked out of the coffee shop with a wide grin. Please tell me you found Tiffany, Carl said. Nope. But PC Nation said the reason we can't catch their ping is because their cameras aren't on. Most likely their batteries are dead, Eric said. Carl was escorted to the dead end bar. The police escort then took him home, where he quickly packed up what he could carry in one trip. They walked out of the house just as Tiffany's Kia with Tim behind the wheel raced by. It's them, shouted Carl, recognizing the white car. But Tim and Tiffany managed to skip around the corner and out of sight before Eliza and Eric could get into their cruiser. Carl looked around the room once more and saw nothing that couldn't be replaced. All the baby pictures and other memorabilia were already at his mother's house. The pots and pans belonged to Tiffany's mother, who being a rather stingy woman had given the couple some rather cheap ones. The plates and silverware Carl couldn't remember if they were his or Tiffany's, so he thought they might be hers. It's sad when I think about it, Carl commented to Elise as the policeman joined him in the living room of the house. But this is where my drug addiction brought me. My whole world fits in the trunk of my car. I have a husband and 2 kids, Elise said, so my whole world fits in one hug, and I'm happy with that. Don't forget to give them more, huh? Carl smiled, locking the door one last time. As Carl entered the trailer where Kirsten and Mike lived, Tim paid no attention to the blinking fuel light. Why didn't you shoot him? Asked Tiffany, rubbing her face. There was a cop in there, yelled Tim, pushing her head into the passenger window. Hey, exclaimed Tiffany. He did it again, and she stopped complaining, thus spoiling Tim's entire pleasure. Call your mother. Maybe we can get some shit out of her, huh? Demanded Tim. Tiffany solemnly pulled her cell phone out of her purse. But it was dead. Her other cell phone, the one Carl was paying for, was also dead. They don't work, she whined. Really? Asked Tim, not believing her. Really, see? She snorted, showing him the dead screen. Tim stopped, picked up her phone and checked it. Sure enough, it wasn't working. He pushed her into the passenger window of the car again. That's enough, shouted Tiffany. Finding an adapter, she plugged a regular PC Nation phone into the car's cigarette lighter and called her mother. Hi, Tiffany. What a wonderful surprise. No, Tiffany, I'm not giving you a dime. Tiffany's mom answered the phone. What? I can't just call my mom. I have to want something. Tiffany lied. Uh-huh. Tiffany's mother said, not believing her daughter. Tiffany hung up the phone and shook her head negatively. Tim pushed her into the passenger window again. But she didn't react. Damn it, Carl. What the hell, huh? She said after a minute, noticing 7 voicemail messages from her husband. Yay, what's with your boy's rotten name, huh? Asked Tim, grinning. Tiffany listened to the first voicemail for a few seconds, and then simply deleted the others. Without listening to them, Tim went to LG to see if he could nail it. There's my boy, Tim said, as he slowly drove through the Waters apartment complex. Hey, dog, you need to make a call, Tim said, and the 15-year-old runner walked to the car. What happened? The boy asked, ignoring the whimpering white woman. Looking for, what, 3? You got about 3? Asked Tim. 300? The boy asked. No, 3 pennies, yes, 300. What do you think, eh? Snapped Tim. Yes, I've got 3, and you've got 3, the boy asked. Get out of my car. You don't have 3. Tim grinned and started the engine. I got about 7, the guy said, and pulled some plastic bags out of his pocket. Tim grabbed the bags and pressed down on the gas pedal, and less than 20 feet away, a Kia that had run out of gas stopped. The runner fired his 9mm pistol at the car, hitting Tiffany in the throat and striking Tim several times. All the while, Tim was trying to drive the car away out of commission. Gunshots are a common occurrence in the Water Street neighborhood. No one called the police. Nearly 2 hours later, 2 police officers patrolling the area of government houses found a crashed car with 2 victims sitting in it with multiple gunshot wounds. The ambulance arrived nearly 50 minutes after 2 officers radioed for 2 ambulances. We told you there were 2 victims. Another officer said, they'll do. Clay Bordlin shrugged and decided the white woman needed more help than the black man. The purse was gone, cell phones were gone. Tim had no ID. Passers-by peered into the mangled car and helped themselves to anything they could get their hands on while the 2 residents sat bleeding from their wounds. They weren't kidding when they said this disease kills, Dauphine said as she hugged Carl. Most people spend a lot of money on funerals because they feel guilty, Donald Pelletier said, looking at the flowers in ornate casket. My mother-in-law, Carl agreed, pointing to the ornate casket and numerous floral arrangements. Then he pointed to the sobbing woman. The woman looked considerably older than her 52 years. Most people don't handle grief well, and Mrs. didn't handle guilt and grief well at all. The members of Together We Stand decided to hold a small meeting during the vigil. There were moments of laughter, but mostly tears were shed. Kirsten paused for a long moment, then said, I guess it's true everyone can want you to get clean. But you have to want it yourself. Gratitude, Dauphine said softly. Yes, gratitude. I'm thankful that my higher power didn't lead me down the same path Tiffany had to walk. You know what I mean? Then she subtly criticized Tiffany's journey, disguised as gratitude. I'm glad I'm not a smug jerk, Carl whispered to Mike, and both men chuckled. The next day Tiffany's mother was inconsolable as the casket was closed and her only child's face was covered for the last time. Mrs. Tiffany's last name continued to sob inconsolably as the casket was carried out of the funeral home. At the graveside, the woman nearly fainted, clinging tightly to her son-in-law. Carl held his mother-in-law while the final prayers were said, then helped the grieving woman to the car. Afterward, he hugged Mike and Kirsten before driving to California. Meanwhile, Morgan managed to secure a job at Seagull Recycling. The work was strenuous, with no benefits and reduced hours due to downsizing. $11 an hour for 24 hours a week. Morgan grimly reminded herself, at least I'm losing weight. She thought about the man with the sad eyes. Almost ready for a bikini body, she mused with a soft smile. George's garage managed to fix what Huala's Texaco couldn't. The mechanic explained that her transmission issues stemmed from Huala's incompetence. Madame Duvalier, Morgan's landlady, showed little sympathy. I'm sorry you've had some unexpected expenses, she said curtly, but rent is due on time, I chowed. Undeterred, Morgan persisted. One afternoon Mrs. Duvalier mentioned a postcard she received while Morgan was returning from Dr. Lemoyne's office. Her mouth still numb from having a second cavity filled. The front of the postcard displayed a picturesque beach with beautiful women in bikinis. And on the other side was Carl's cell number. The score is still 119 to 102, he wrote. Morgan glanced at the clock. It was around 3 in the afternoon in Santa Barbara's. Besides, her mouth was still too numb to speak coherently. When Morgan finally felt her mouth had recovered enough to make a sensible call, she dialed Carl's number. Hey, got your postcard? She greeted him cheerfully. Uh-huh, he replied, equally cheerful. They talked for quite some time until Madame Duvalier called out bedtime from the next room. So when's a good time for you to call? Morgan asked. Anytime, he replied. What's the best time for you? She asked. Anytime, he agreed. Morgan glanced at the postcard again with its sparkling water, clean sand, and beautiful bodies. She received her paycheck every 2 weeks, and the last one was nearly spent, with 5 days to go until the next one. The other day, a torrential downpour drenched the area. A heavy, piercing rain that made it impossible to think inside the sweltering metal building. When Morgan finally finished her shift, the rain was still pouring relentlessly. By the time she reached her car, she was completely soaked through. She glanced again at the bright, vibrant postcard depicting endless sunlight. Meanwhile, in his apartment, Carl was sipping scalding hot coffee when he received a text message. May I visit you? Morgan sent. Bring your own bikini, he replied. BYOB, she responded, adding an emoji. Bring your own bikini, he clarified. Anything else? Nothing else. He sent back, smiling.